Okay, Fear, this is Afterthoughts. This is the little bit of time that we take and talk through the sermon that was just preached so that we can have, just further discussion and further conversation. Today, Thomas preached on Psalm 22. Enjoyed it. It was good. There's a lot, how you usually have your rabbit trail of thinking. I had some of those myself while you were preaching today. So before I start, though, I'm going to give you the opportunity. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about? You didn't get the opportunity, or was it pretty straightforward?
Pretty straightforward because as reading this, I just felt like that people need to hear these kinds of sermons. That it was funny because the last time I preached and went through the psalm, I had done all this research, made all these connections, and not in a bad way, but the comment was made, this was a different, like not lecture, but that kind of informative, structured sermon. And I love those. And I think there's Psalms that are like that. But with Psalm 22, the reason I chose that is that it's much less the amount of like understanding these truths as much as it is receiving them
Right.
and enduring, which is part of the reason the Psalm exists.
It's
So,
dealing with a lot of emotion.
right.
I mean, that's really what's pushing it, right?
Psalms that touch the heart to understand God, but the head to touch the truth about God. And then the Psalms touch the heart as we're going through these kinds of things. And that's what this was in a big way.
So as you were talking about it, when you brought up the idea of the mountains and the valleys, and to have mountains, you have to have valleys, and
Mm-hmm.
then you had this quote that you said that you tell your students, and it was, "The truth of God is the rock we cling to, even when our hearts are broken."
Mm-hmm.
Was that right? Did I get
Yes.
that right?
Yep.
Okay. So the truth of God is the rock we cling to, even when our hearts are broken. And it started really making me think about the mountains and the valleys. And I think it really spoke to, as pastors, what we try to teach people. But then I do a lot of counseling, a lot of biblical counseling as well. And there's an element here that I think is really important. And this is kind of where my rabbit trail started. Like, you totally took it there. But many people come to Jesus when they're at their low. Some people don't. Some people don't have that. But I think, I mean, the essentialness of being saved is understanding your own depravity and your need for that forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So many people come to Christ when they're in a low valley. I'm gonna stick with the metaphor, a low valley, and God like carries them through, and they have this renewed self and this renewed heart, and then things start to get better. It happens in our walk with God. It happens in counseling. It happens in many people do this. Well, they come out and they start to get back up that mountain, and they start taking credit for themselves and how they're doing better. And they don't take that high time, that time when they're not in despair, and seek the truth of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing that we notice that David, as he's pulling through this whole thing, is that he's praising God when he's high, and he's praising God when he's low, because he has spent countless hours on learning the truth of God. And so they don't learn it here, so that when they go back down to the next valley, they're feeling as if they're abandoned, and they don't have what David has of being able to then turn and go, finish it out with praise and
Mm-hmm.
and truth. And so that, I think we waste so much precious time that he's given us to walk with him in normal times and in good times, that when it does get low, you said, the way you said was that a lot of people will abandon him in their despair.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason they do that, the only reason they can do that, is because they don't walk with him all of the other times, right?
I think that's where you have the two instances. They abandon in their despair, but they also abandon in the time of plenty.
Right.
And that's why, again, I love, okay, so it's not my notes, but in thinking about the book of Job, that's one of the reasons why when Job was prosperous and everything was good, he was making sacrifices on behalf of his children on a regular basis just in case they sinned. Like, he was, again, everything was fine, but he was diligent. And so when this trial came, it was in the midst of all the being this diligent, which is part of the reason he calls out, like, what went wrong? What did
Right.
I do? Why do I deserve this? And he asks for that vindication. But I think that's what in some ways kind of carries us through, from the sense of, when I tell my boys, when you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing and something goes wrong, and I think I use this language when it comes to virtue as well, that you don't have to wonder, it's one thing when I do something stupid and I know that I'm suffering my consequences. It's another thing to know I didn't do anything wrong and I have no reason to hang my head in terms of what I've done. I just have to, I use this metaphor loosely, keep the chin up and endure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it does help in that sense, because it's again, there were times David, and some of the songs are like this, like, oh, because of Bathsheba, I have gone through these things because of what we did.
Yeah.
But there's other
and
times
then
we
it
don't know.
may be true, right? Like, so like, I say it on a regular basis. I have to deal with the consequences for my own sins, and I can accept that. But then, like you said, there's those times when, why in the world am I going through this?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't just something go the way it's supposed to? That's good. One of the other things you started out the sermon with was, when we're feeling bad or when we're feeling down, somebody either says it to us, or we may even say it to ourselves, is that, well, there's other people who have it worse. And then you turn that and you say, well, then if we're going to do that, then there's always somebody who has it better. So there's no reason to be happy or sad, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Carrying that out to its logical conclusion. Again, this goes with counseling. I mean, there's a lot of counseling goodness in this psalm. And
To be clear, I was saying that that's how the world presents it.
no,
I was not teaching that.
No, I'm
Okay.
gonna get there. No,
Okay.
no. Yeah, my bad. Yeah, you have to watch the sermon to get all of these. Yeah. So, yeah, no, you're not teaching that, right? But what you were teaching was, don't minimize your pain, don't minimize the suffering, don't minimize the situation. And then I took that the next step further, and also don't make a mountain out of a molehill, right? Mm. And so there's something that is essential for us to get through these times in this life. There's something that is essential to look at a situation for what it actually is, not for the truth, for what's real, what corresponds to reality, not like all of the anxieties that people bring with them, and or minimizing it, pretending it's not a big deal, because then it comes back and gets you, like when you do that. And so you're talking through that and not minimizing it. And then I went into not making a mountain out of a molehill, but then we continue and we see David start talking about, when we get into 12, many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. And then he just keeps going into this imagery of just how much suffering he's going through. And I don't think he's making a mountain out of a molehill, but he is using an element of metaphor, maybe an element of hyperbole, to truly kind of put words to how much despair and sorrow he's going through. So I don't know where I'm going with that, other than it's so important for us as we deal with our life situations to look at them for what they really are, and not being Chicken Little that the sky is falling all the time.
Well, and this is why this kind of imagery, by talking about bulls and lions and just representing the strength and the fierceness, there is this sense with the way poetry works and the way particularly the Psalms work, there is an element. Who are those bulls that might be surrounding us? Who are those people? What's the situation? Like, I'm pretty sure he has people. But we might be facing those kinds of things that we feel could destroy us, that could bowl us over. And so that's why the power behind the wisdom literature that Psalm falls under is, again, it's meant for you to consider and realize, okay, David's going through this. I have something analogous.
Right.
Okay. And now they might be smaller bulls. It might be, like you might recognize, well, this is not going to overcome me. But even when you face these kinds of things, like what I said in my sermon, that, one bull would take me out, one lion would take me out. That's where that kind of dependence, where you have to, like, this is in God's hands. And we're going to face those situations. David apparently faces this kind of situation. And we also have the rest of his life. We have his story, so we see exactly how it pans out. But I also never want to communicate that, almost like what happens in the movie, like it always pans out. Like,
Yeah.
that in terms of the here and now, because even when we face those valleys and those difficulties, it doesn't mean that we'll make it out on this side. Like you see this with the apostles.
I mean, 11 of the
You
12, I say it all the time, 11 of the 12 apostles faced gruesome, horrible deaths, right? Like, that doesn't mean it pans out how we want it to pan out.
and you've got Paul, and I didn't. So again, should have mentioned this as well. Paul, when he was called, God basically said, I'm going to show him how much he will suffer for me. And that does not fit into our prosperity teachings.
Right.
That does not fit
Not our
into,
prosperity
yeah,
teachings.
the American,
There you go.
like, no, God's going to make your life better. And I've taught this before, for Paul and for the apostles, there is a sense in which their lives were made worse from knowing Jesus if we measure entirely by physical comforts
Right.
and by ease of living. There were much easier means of living. There were, Paul was a Pharisee. I mean, he's like, a religious CEO, basically. Okay, so he's top notch. And when we see what it costs them and the suffering they had to endure, we forget they took this willingly, and some of it they didn't know. Like Paul didn't know he was going to get shipwrecked, be eaten by snakes, stoned twice, left for dead. Like you go on the list, like, oh, this is kind of gruesome. And eventually he goes to Rome, and people might be thinking, oh, Peter got out of jail, maybe Paul got out, and then they get the news that Paul was finally beheaded.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the end. John the Baptist, the first prophet that Israel had seen since the days of Malachi, and lost his head. So we
served on a platter.
Yeah, we look at these things gruesome. We look at this, and there's some element we might say, where is God? But he's with us all the way. That these are the purposes. God does have these kinds of purposes, and when we trust him, we know that he's good. It's no longer a cliche.
Right.
It's truth that we cling to.
Well, and the weightier side of that, and I don't want to, it's easy for me to always go towards those, the gruesome, but the weightier side of that is we can look at, while their life may have been a life of inconvenience and some pain and suffering, the weightier side was they experienced love greater than they ever would have experienced. They experienced joy more than they, when they brought people to the Lord, when they had their church family, when they were with them. They experienced a peace in these situations that, usually when they face these types of things, people just fall apart and crumble. But these men, and they don't. They stand strong. They're in prison writing letters, encouraging others. So, yeah, I think you're right. If we measure it by the worldly comforts, yeah, not so good. But if we measure it against a life well lived, everything that you preached this morning is, it gives us that life well lived.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really enjoyed the sermon. I have lots of notes on this one. I have some that I'm going to talk to you about offline, and we will, nothing bad. But we'll talk to you about it offline. And I appreciate it. And I appreciate Cape Fear for listening. Check out the sermon, and you can see what we're talking about. We'll talk to you guys next time.